Well, in the interest of jumping forward to our next wonderful session, I now have the honor of reintroducing Aaron Benavot to lead the next session. He's a professor of global education policy at the University of Albany SUNY, an expert on comparative education research and international education policies. Aaron worked for 8 years at UNESCO on the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is an independent evidence-based report analyzing progress towards international education targets. He's also written extensively about education for sustainable development and global citizenship education, which are key aspects of SDG Target 4.7, addressing global commitments to transforming education. Aaron also serves as lead of indicator development for the MECCE Project, which is a 6-year study on monitoring and evaluating climate communication and education, which seeks to inform intergovernmental negotiations and policy discussions involving climate change education. I continue to deeply consider your remarks from this morning and really look forward to this session. So over to you, Aaron.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for your kind introduction. And what a fascinating book to hear about of Peter's. And I also look forward to reading more carefully. A very interesting analysis and experience that he conveys. So this is a little bit of a shift. We're moving from the local to the global. What I have the pleasure of moderating is a session that will have basically 3 parts to it. The first part is my colleague Aaron Redman, who works on the MECCE Project, will tell us a little bit about the MECCE Project and how it can be used or potentially has something to say around the monitoring of Target 4.7, or at least aspects thereof. Then I will take the floor and give some additional comments, linking a little bit more carefully these 2 agendas, the agenda around the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change and SDG 4.7. And then I will be very pleased to welcome questions from the floor that you might have for my colleague, Aaron. So here we have a session with 2 Aarons, and I'm going to allow my colleague, Aaron Redman, to introduce himself and go ahead and show the slides that he's prepared.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's been really great to hear the whole wide variety of presentations. I'm Aaron Redman, and I've been working on the MECCE project now for over a year. And I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. We don't want to take up too much time, so we still have time to have a little bit of a conversation. And all this information is also available on our website as well, so to follow up with. You already heard a little bit about us, but we're a global network of universities, primarily with our sort of home at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, focused on quality and quantity of climate change communication and education. Our project has 3 what we call axes, or sort of work areas. The first one is the country profiles and case studies, indicator development, and knowledge mobilization. I'm going to talk about each one of them and how they link to measuring progress towards SDG 4.7 in particular. This is just sort of a recent an overview of our activities that we have going on right now, which I'll talk about in more depth on each one. But one that I wanted to point out to all of you is that one part of our work is the development of regional hubs. And so we would encourage anyone who's interested in joining and being part of the MECCE project and benefiting and contributing to the work that we're doing to reach out and look into joining one of the regional hubs. We have so the contacts at the end for the Americas hub, but you can also jump onto our website if you would prefer or are located somewhere else geographically in the world. So the first axis consists of case studies and country profiles. And so in this one, we're really, especially in the case studies, we're interested in developing evidence around the quality of climate change education. So when we're talking about measuring things, we oftentimes end up, just looking at the quantity or amount, but part of our project is to look at both dimensions and how we can measure both the quantity and the quality. And so the case studies are trying to create rigorous evidence around the quality. So we're funding these case studies and funded 12 of them last year. We actually have an open call out for more case studies right now that's wrapping up in 2 days. So if you are interested potentially in submitting a proposal for a case study, you still have time, and we would welcome that. Right now, we have ones from all over the world, and we're really excited to build this body of evidence around the types of really high level and quality climate change education that's being done. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was the country profiles that we're doing. And we've so far developed 50 country profiles for countries all over the world. This is one of the work that we're doing in collaboration with the UNESCO GEM report. And we're working on rolling out another up to 30 more this year as well, in time for COP28. And you can see from this slide here, the sort of outline that that each country profile has. We have with the country profiles a sort of coherent and similar structure. So providing this in-depth thing, but in a way that you could read through each one and learn similar things about how each country is doing in terms of their climate change education and communication. Just to give an example, since we are sort of focusing a little bit here on the US case, we have a country profile for the United States. And to do that, as for all of them, we sort of have a similar set of data that we collect. We look for self-reported data. Aaron mentioned earlier in his talk this morning, that there is issues around self-reporting that we have experienced with measuring 4.7 and just in general. But at the same time, these self-reports such as NAPs can offer a lot of information. We go out there looking for things like national curricular frameworks for each country. And in some cases, we can find all these, they've already been collected in one place, and other times we're out there searching ourselves. We try to find sort of a similar set of documents for each country. So for example, for the US, the country profile includes a description of a law passed 2 years ago, requiring the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to establish a federal climate change education program. We have evidence from both what government and non-governmental entities are doing. And I think one of the other interesting things about the US case that we begin to run into when we talk about measuring here is the US, as I'm sure most of you are aware, has a federalized, non-centralized education system. And so, how can we measure at the country level, which is the way we do, reporting under the SDGs and as well as under, COP as well. And so we've been exploring that. We had an opportunity partnering with the NAAEE to look at how different states are doing and try to measure it at the subnational level. And we're hoping that the sort of lessons and learning that we can take in terms of measuring at the subnational level can begin to be applied in the many other systems that are non-centralized that exist around the world, whether that be Germany or India. Or other countries where, it's important that we get below the subnational level, because otherwise, for example, the US has no, national curricular framework because such a thing doesn't make sense in our bottom-up K through 12 education system. So here's some, like I said, one of the other things we're doing besides this in both the case studies and the country profiles is, while they're focused on, really the in-depth knowledge in each place and case and country, we also, by building up this big database of things that are collected in with the same format and the same template and the same types of data, we're going to be able to do some really interesting cross-country and cross-case comparisons. We're beginning to be able to do that now with our first 50 profiles of the countries. And as we expand that, then we hope to find some really robust results about patterns that we see between countries in terms of measuring their progress on climate change. Moving on to axis number 2 is focused on indicator development, which is the main area that Aaron and I both work on within the MECCE project. Is this illustration here, which I'm not going to get into in detail, lays out the process that we used and the framework that we used for developing the indicators. And in terms of this, maybe the more traditional way in which we think about measuring things like the SDGs and as well as climate related things. What I want to emphasize here is we had this process for looking really broadly at all the different types of data sets that are out there and the types of data and a set of criteria in which we could really begin to narrow it down. And when you get to that, this is sort of one of these things, and I'm sure anyone who's sort of gotten into thinking about how to measure 4.7 comes across this, where you see while it seems like there's a lot of different ideas and data out there, but as soon as you say, well, I want to make sure I'm covering everywhere in the world, all of a sudden you get down to a very narrow set of options. If you say, well, I want something that, has, robust outcome-oriented types of data, you get even a smaller set of options. So what we find when we go through this, everything that we could find and all this different data is that we're really, going to need to be creating data if we really want to understand, all that's happening in this space. So for COP27, which was last November, we rolled out our first set of 9 indicators, which are listed here. These, just to give you a sense of what this is, like I mentioned, having the global coverage was critical to us. We did find, indicators, at least something that covered everywhere. And we do have broad coverage, but you can see there are certain regions and countries, which are much better represented by the current set of indicators, such as Europe and South America, and other regions like the Sahel or Central Asia, which are, much less well represented by the current set of indicators that we have. To give you an example of what we're doing for the indicators, so one of them that's focused on primary and secondary education that we're describing as integration of climate change and curriculum policy. This focuses on, you may remember I mentioned on the country profiles that we've collected national curricular frameworks for lots of countries. We've expanded that to even more countries and been building out this database of these policy documents of education for nearly 160 countries now. And we use these documents to do an analysis across a whole large number of languages, which we're working on expanding right now, and looking for keywords related to climate change education, as well as sustainability and environmental education. And based on the amount of those keywords as a proxy for the integration of these themes in their policy frameworks, we sort of basically assigned a level between 1 and 5, which was what we did for all our indicators. And that gives you the following results, which you can see. We have these type of results for each of our indicator to give us a sense of the overall picture here. And you can obviously go into an individual country and see, how that individual country is doing as well. What we see here, for example, for this one is, that we found pretty good coverage, pretty even coverage, I guess you might say, across the different regions of the world, which we see as, this is the advantage of this database that we've essentially generated ourselves, is being able to focus on that regional coverage. A lot of the existing data has its own regional biases based on whoever is the one collecting the data. If it's a OECD, then it's very OECD focused, or if it's a European based thing, et cetera. And that no region is really standing out here as doing excellent. In fact, the only country which achieved our level 5 ranking here was the Marshall Islands, had a large amount of climate change in their national curricular framework. So finally, moving on to the knowledge mobilization axes, we have launched as well at COP27 what we call an interactive data platform. And in here you can find, you'll be able to find access to all the case studies. You can go and read all the country profiles that are so far published, all 50 of them, as well as finding out and exploring the 9 indicators that we've already posted. So that includes looking at how they're mapped, looking at graphs, listing the countries, reading about the methods, exploring them and doing some comparisons based on regional and other filtering criteria. We're going to be continuing to roll out new features on this, as well as adding more country profiles, adding more case studies, adding more indicators, and upgrading the indicators that now exist on there already. So I think that pretty much covers what the overview of sort of what we're doing in terms of measuring climate change education, both from a quality and quantity standpoint, and its links to 4.7. In particular, I just wanted to, like I said, promised at the beginning, wanted to mention as well that we have, these regional hubs, including one for the Americas, whose contacts of the leads of that I put up here, as well as, our contacts as well. I'd love to talk to anyone afterwards if there's not time for other questions or follow-up. So that's, I think, all I got for now. Aaron, I'll pass it back to you. You're still muted, Aaron.
So for a few minutes, I'd just like to make more explicit the possible linkage between the work of the MECCE Project and the monitoring of 4.7, and all the challenges that involves, and also maybe speak a little bit more about the limitations, and there certainly are many. It's obvious target 4.7 is this grandiose target that includes basically all the wonderful humanistic and global aims around education, whether it be talked in terms of global citizenship, education for sustainability, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global appreciation of cultural diversity. Everything but the kitchen sink was added here in 4.7. In some ways, I always think of 4.7 in kind of in contrast to some of the other targets, which tend to be either focused exclusively on foundational skills or on learning outcomes that are much more instrumental in their relationship to the labor market or the economy. And 4.7 in that sense is unusual because it speaks, first of all, to the broader sustainable development agenda. In some ways, this is the connecting tissue target, but it also provides a discussion of this broader humanistic agenda. There is an indicator that's been articulated by the folks in New York as to how it could be measured, which you also see here on this map and on this graph. And, it can be found here, the extent to which global citizenship, education, ESD are included in national policies and curricula and teacher assessment in teacher education and student assessment. So I think the first point to make very clear is that the MECCE Project speaks to one aspect of Target 4.7 and tries to provide a new kind of monitoring infrastructure to tap into that one aspect. Clearly, there are other dimensions to Target 4.7 that are not being measured. The other point to be made is that there's a separate target in the climate action target, which is 13.3, that also speaks about the importance of climate change education. And there, it also has a slightly different indicator. And here, the work of the MECCE Project is more, as it were, relevant or aligned. But the main point that I wish to make here is that the MECCE Project is by and large focused on, in some ways, a very different international policy regime, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was established in 1992. And from the very beginning, there is a paragraph or a commitment to what's called the Action for Climate Empowerment. And it has 6 different components. And much of the work of the MECCE Project is really to try and provide insight about the quality and quantity of ACE, of Action for Climate Empowerment, along each of these different dimensions. Education in the MECCE Project is distinguished between, as we saw, primary and secondary education on the one hand, and higher education on the other. Now, what is also kind of interesting is that after the SDGs were established, we have this new initiative or this new urgency around seeing education as a driver for broader transformation, indicated in part by the summit that took place last November. And as most of you are aware, what came out of the summit was a list of 7 initiatives. And these don't have the same, let's say, status as the SDGs by any stretch of the imagination. There were not representatives from all the member states at that summit, but this was a consensus document that came out of that summit. And the very first initiative speaks about greening education to get every learner climate ready. And beyond that, the summit also called for a particular accountability initiative around accountability approach to these 7 initiatives based on what's called the National SDG 4 benchmarking process. And it mandated UNESCO's Institute for Statistics and the Global Education Monitoring Report to come up with a way of monitoring and measuring this greening education initiative. And so maybe just a moment to say what this national benchmarking business is all about. How should I put it? In some ways, the international community, well, let's start from a very basic point. If you look at the foundational document of the 2030 agenda, the word monitoring does not appear. Countries are not exactly excited to be held to account for their action or inaction. And the word in particular, monitoring, is one that they feel, I wouldn't even say ambivalent, but fairly antagonistic. The euphemism that's used in that document is follow-up and review, follow-up and review. Up until the SDGs, most of the time that countries were being monitored or followed up and reviewed, it was that there was a particular international target that all countries were meant to reach. But recently, the idea is that this is very difficult for countries, especially given their initial placements where they may be on the process of trying to make progress, that it makes more sense to develop, first of all, intermediate benchmarks, and even go a step further and say, well, if a country is along a pathway that we can somehow articulate, maybe what we should do is kind of monitor progress of where they begin and the extent that they're making good along that pathway. And in some ways, that's what these national benchmarks are all about, is setting up pathways for certain kinds of educational dimensions and trying to use country documents to establish where they are and how much progress measured could be indicated through existing data. So the UIS, the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, and the GEM report have been working hard with countries to develop these national benchmarks. And this is what it looks like. By and large, there are 7 benchmark indicators for SDG 4, but notice for 4.7, no such benchmark has been developed. That's also true for the one on learning. And so in other words, these benchmarks were selectively chosen partly because of how well they were developed previously. But the target that we've been talking about, no such benchmark was developed. But now, based on the summit, there's this initiative on greening education, and as it were, a certain urgency placed both on the GEM report and UIS to come up with a potential indicator around the greening education indicator. And here, the work of the MECCE Project provides not the only approach that could be taken, but a approach that says this is one way to develop potentially a benchmarking indicator for the greening of education or for green education, looking at the extent to which countries make good on their commitments in basic policy documents. And recently, the leadership of the MECCE Project has also won a bid through UNESCO to collect subject syllabi in science and social science subjects for up to 8 subject areas for about 80 countries in different SDG regions. This too can be analyzed like the policy documents and provide a more complete, not necessarily entirely complete, but certainly the syllabi subject documents tell us a little bit tell us in much greater detail. They're typically written by curriculum specialists and they're meant to be for teachers and so on and so forth. They provide a much more accurate depiction of some of the content that is meant to get into the classroom. So this is an article that my colleague and I are writing about how the current monitoring of 4.7 is unfit for purpose. I'm happy for you to take a look at it. It'll be coming out very soon. But the main point that I wish to make is that the MECCE Project not only wishes to provide information that would be relevant for the UNFCCC, but at least an aspect of 4.7 and 13.3, and potentially a way of monitoring this greening education initiative. So we do think that there's some multi-purposes there. Again, this not to say that this is the only approach that could be taken, but I think there is a sense that in the current state of affairs where so little activity at this level has taken place, it's worth making an effort along the lines that we articulated. All right, so shall we open it up now for some questions? I realize this is a very different kind of activity than some of the work that we've heard during the course of the day, but I'm sure both Aaron and I would be very keen to hear colleagues' thoughts about the approach and some of the work that's been undertaken. If you could raise your hand, or maybe I'll take a look and see if there's some things here, but is there anyone who would like to ask a question about what has been described?
I just have a quick question, not necessarily about the substance of what you've said, but do you offer, this is to Aaron Redman, do you offer internships, field experiences for graduate students?
Actually, maybe I'll let Aaron talk about that. He has actually better things to say about that. But
well, I mean, Lucy, it's a great question. A lot of this work that we're doing would not have been accomplished if not for the enormous effort of many graduate students located throughout the world. Literally, the team meetings that we have around access to often involved multiple time zones with people in many different countries who do have access sometimes to detailed information in their region or speak languages that enable us to kind of understand and look at the documents. So the answer is we always are looking for, and many of the people that are writing the country profiles that Aaron mentioned, there are literally dozens of people that have been involved, many of them graduate students. Partly we were looking for people that are not otherwise kind of committed to a particular regime or political system, but have a certain ability to search for documents and other kinds of evidence wherever the search may take them. So we felt that it was actually better to mobilize graduate students in many different parts of the world. So if you are interested, send us your particulars or send it to our project coordinator at the University of Saskatchewan, Nicholas, and we'd be happy to follow up. Avram, I see you have a question.
Yeah, so I work in the solar installation field, and now I am taking this practice and working in developing nations. So we have projects who I'm working with in West Africa, as well as some Pacific islands. And so how could I use the information that you guys have and somehow incorporate the curriculum that we're putting together in a larger scheme? Because just showing that list, I didn't realize that I was addressing some of the SDG indicators that have nothing going on right now. So I want to know more about what you guys are doing and be able to get young people involved as well. I'm a part of the UN Association of America, which has branches all over. And my organization, we encourage kids to join in because it's free for anybody under 25, and it gives them access to UN publications as well as to UN events. And so I want to know, how can I partner with you guys, get involved with what you guys are doing, and get the students on board. I'm just now introducing a program to RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, here where I'm at. And so I think this would be something very much in their wheelhouse. I'm a Syracuse alum. We have SUNY ESF over there. So I want to do some work here. I'm a New York guy, so I gotta shout out to and call out our universities. And so I just want to know, how can I get involved and how can I play a role in growing what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit on that. And maybe Aaron wants to add something as well. But I see immediately a couple things in that. One is, as we mentioned before, I think in the chat, like, look into maybe the regional hubs. It's just a good way to, get an introductory level of involvement and to be connected to things that are happening and also to contribute back. And then the second thing, just in terms of information, would be you may find it really interesting to go and look at the country profiles of areas you're working in. You can get a really good overview of the types of, there may be policies or activities or things happening or other organizations that you didn't know about that could connect you to that as well. And then the third thing would be, especially as this case study database gets built up, there likely will be, some cases in there that might really inform the work you're doing as well. I'm going to pass it back to Aaron, and we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah, we need to conclude now. I would say that, the other thing that's available, and again, it's very different from the SDGs, is that there are ACE focal points in each country around the world. And oftentimes they're developing policy documents to help the government and NGOs and civil society move forward with respect to their climate change educational plans. So in my view, there is an ACE focal point for the US, and I'm sure that informing that person about the work you're doing would be a great way forward. And in our particular interest, we also are trying to keep tabs of countries or even states that are developing monitoring and evaluation systems around climate change education. So to the extent that there is an aspect of that, that would be very interesting too. I think we're going to have to leave it at that. We're very, first of all, let me give my thanks to Aaron Redman for the presentation and for all the kind people in the audience for listening. And I'll send it over to, I believe it's Caroline to move us forward.
Thank you so much, Aaron and Aaron. Really appreciate that presentation, and I'm just enjoying how the common threads between these very distinct approaches to the content are connecting so well. And with that, I'm just going to hand over to Radhika to introduce the next session. Thank you so much again.